The job had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 6 months, $80,000 a year. Full benefits. One condition: drive a car that hadn't left the garage in 3 years for a woman who hadn't left her estate in just as long. No one applied. Until Ethan Reed did. His hands were calloused. His bank account held $17.32. An eviction notice was taped to the refrigerator like a countdown. He wasn't brave. He was desperate. But the moment he stepped through those iron gates, something felt wrong, the kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself. It settles in your chest, quiet and cold. Because Margaret Whitmore already knew his name before he introduced himself. She had been waiting for him. And what she was waiting to confess would break everything he thought he had survived. The town of Mystic, Connecticut had a way of keeping its secrets behind iron and ivy. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of Alderman Road, like a held breath, Victorian architecture, black iron gates and hedgerows trimmed so precisely they looked afraid to grow. People drove past it on their way to work, on their way to school, on their way to Sunday church, and they kept their eyes forward. Not out of indifference, out of the particular discomfort that comes from witnessing grief so large it swallows a house whole. Margaret Whitmore had not been seen in public in 3 years. The job listing had appeared in the county paper 6 months ago, tucked between a dental assistant posting and a notice for a lost retriever. Driver needed. Personal vehicle provided. $80,000 annually. No prior employer had offered that kind of money for something so simple. No one in Mystic called the number. The filing cabinet in the hiring office had swallowed the listing quietly, the way the town swallowed everything connected to that house. Until Ethan Reed called on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen of his rental on Maple Street, staring at a notice from the county sheriff's office that was held to the refrigerator by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. The notice gave him 30 days. He had $17.32 in his checking account and a 10-year-old daughter who hadn't touched her sketchbook in 4 months. He called the number. He was hired before the week was out. Ethan had trained as a veterinarian, and the discipline had shaped him the patience, the steadiness under pressure, the ability to read a creature's distress in the way it held its body. He'd been good at it. Then the clinic he worked for consolidated with a regional chain. His position was eliminated, and 3 years of trying to rebuild had left his hands rough from work that wasn't his, and his bank account empty in a way that felt permanent. His wife Sarah had died on a stretch of Route 11 with no streetlights. A wet October road, a pickup truck crossing the center line, and then she was simply gone. Grace had been 7, old enough to understand, too young to know what to do with it. These days, Grace sat at the kitchen table each morning and stirred her cereal in slow circles without eating. She was 10 now, dark-eyed, quiet in the particular way that worried teachers. Her sketchbook sat on the corner of her desk, untouched. She used to fill those pages with horses and imaginary houses and elaborate maps of places she invented. She had stopped the week after her mother's funeral and hadn't explained why. Ethan never pushed. He understood more than he wanted, to the weight of a thing you used to love suddenly feeling impossible. The first morning he arrived at the Whitmore estate, a man named Gerald Assistant 50's suit, pressed so hard it could stand on its own, led him through the side gate to the garage. The car was a black Mercedes S-Class, spotless. It had 400 miles on the odometer, 3 years old. Ethan ran his hand along the hood before he got in. Gerald handed him a small device, a 2-way intercom unit, and told him Mrs. Whitmore would communicate through the corresponding unit, installed in the rear partition. Ethan looked at the partition, dark glass, seamless. "She won't be coming to the door," Gerald said. She never did. She appeared beside the car at 8:15, moving quickly, shoulders drawn and wearing dark clothes that made her look like she was trying to disappear against the morning. She was older than her photographs. Ethan had looked her up the way anyone would. In those pictures, she stood at charity galas and ribbon cuttings, silver-haired, and composed, the kind of woman a room noticed. In person, she looked like the version of that woman who had survived something and hadn't decided yet whether that was good news. She got into the back seat without a word. Then, before the intercom crackled with the day's first instruction, she said quietly through the partition, as if confirming something she already knew. "You're Ethan Reed." He hadn't introduced himself. Gerald had never mentioned his full name in her presence. He was certain of that. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She said nothing else. A beat later, the intercom clicked on. "Proceed to the county assessor's office on Birch and 2nd. Her voice through the speaker was flat controlled. He drove, but he kept his eyes on the rearview mirror for just a moment longer than he should have. The pattern established itself within the first week. Each morning she appeared. Each morning the intercom gave him directions. Each morning he noticed things she didn't offer. Her hands trembled when she adjusted her coat. Not constantly, only when they pulled up to a building. She never went inside. She sent Gerald or another assistant, or made calls from the back seat. Documents arrived at the car window like offerings. She reviewed them, signed them, and handed them back through a 2-inch gap in the window. She never opened the door. Once at the county courthouse, he watched an assistant jog out with a folder and stand in the cold, while Margaret's hand appeared through that gap to accept it. The assistant's breath made small clouds in the air. Margaret's hand was bare, no gloves. She held the folder with the particular care of someone holding something breakable. Every Wednesday at 2:15 without exception, he drove her to Greenfield Cemetery on the edge of town. She walked from the car to a grave 11 rows in and stood there for 17 minutes. He knew the time because he counted the first 3 weeks, not meaning to, and then couldn't stop. He never asked who was buried there. He already knew. He had read about Michael Whitmore, the obituary, the public record. 29 years old. Found in the east wing of the estate. The word accidental appearing in careful proximity to other words that meant something more specific. 3 years ago. The same year Sarah died. Ethan didn't know what to do with that coincidence, so he set it down in the back of his mind and left it there. The first crack came on a Thursday in early November. Ethan's phone buzzed while he was waiting in the car outside the land records office, Grace's school. He let it go to voicemail, then listened while Margaret's assistant was still inside. The school counselor's voice was careful in the way school counselors are when they've thought about what they're going to say. Grace was withdrawing. She apologized for things that weren't her fault. She had stopped participating in art class, the one class where she used to come alive. They were requesting a parent-teacher conference. Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock. He looked at his schedule. He had a pickup from the estate at 2:30. When Margaret returned to the car, he said through the intercom, "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to request a schedule adjustment for tomorrow afternoon." "What kind of adjustment?" "My daughter's school wants to meet with me at 3. I can have you back by 2:15 and arrange for Gerald to—" "How old is your daughter?" The question came without preamble. 10, he said. A long beat passed. He kept his eyes on the road. What did the school say? It wasn't quite a question. He told her not the whole of it, but enough. That Grace had lost her mother 3 years ago. That she'd stopped drawing. That the counselor used words like withdrawn and self-isolating. And that each of those words landed on him like something physical. The intercom stayed open. He could hear her breathing on the other side of the partition. She stopped drawing. Margaret's voice had changed something in it, had shifted the way temperature shifts before rain. When did she stop? Right after her mother's funeral. Another silence. Then, "Take me home. I'll have Gerald handle the 2 o'clock. He turned the car around. The next day after the parent-teacher conference, where the counselor showed him a blank sketchbook page and explained that Grace had been staring at it for 40 minutes without making a mark, he returned to the estate to submit his hours. Gerald met him at the gate and handed him a wrapped package without explanation. Inside was a watercolor set, not the kind sold at craft stores. Professional grade, 48, colors the brushes made of actual sable, the kind that cost more than a week of his previous salary. Beneath it, a note card. The handwriting was small and careful. Your daughter doesn't owe anyone a reason for the silence. But if she ever wants to come back to color, these are waiting for her. No signature. He drove home with the package on the passenger seat and said nothing to Grace about who it was from. He set it on her desk beside the untouched sketchbook and went to make dinner. At 10:30 that night, he walked past her room and saw the light still on under the door. He pushed it open an inch. Grace was at her desk, bent over the paper, a brush in her hand. A garden was taking shape. Simple, careful. The lines a little uncertain. But there. Real. He stood in the doorway and didn't go in, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He didn't mention the note card to Margaret the following Monday, but when he held the car door, she still hadn't opened it herself. Once, still let the door swing wide, and settled herself in with that same tight economy of movement. He said before he closed it. She painted last night, first time since the funeral. The door was almost shut. He heard just before the latch caught. Good. One word, but the way she said it, not clipped, not formal. The way the words sat in the air after the door closed made him reconsider something he'd been carrying since the day he first drove through those iron gates. The town had a version of Margaret Whitmore, the story people told when they passed the estate without looking at it. Cold reclusive, a woman who had sealed herself off from the world and let her grief become a wall. He drove that morning and thought about the handwriting on the note card, the 48 colors she had chosen, the fact that she had known without being told exactly what a grieving 10-year-old girl might need. The wall was still there, but for the first time he thought he could see where the mortar had started to thin. It started with a door that had been locked for 3 years. On a Wednesday afternoon in late November, after the cemetery visit, Margaret didn't go back inside the main house. She walked to a side entrance, a heavy wooden door set into the estate's lower level, half hidden by a trellis, and stopped in front of it. She stood there long enough that Ethan got out of the car and crossed the gravel without quite deciding to. Mrs. Whitmore. She turned. Her expression wasn't startled. More like she'd been waiting to be interrupted, had needed it. My son built things down here, she said. Ceramics. He had a wheel a kiln. I haven't opened it since. Ethan looked at the door. I can help if you want it cleared out. I don't want it cleared out. Her voice was firm. I want it not to rot. She handed him a key she'd been holding so long it was warm. The basement workshop was exactly what it looked like from the outside, a room that had been mid-sentence when someone walked out of it and never came back. Shelves of clay in various stages of drying, tools hanging on pegboard, a wheel with a thin skin of dust on the seat, and a kiln in the corner that still smelled faintly of fired earth. On the center table, a bowl wide-mouthed, uneven, in the way that handmade things are uneven, glazed in deep blue. Finished. Never collected. Ethan worked in there during his lunch hour 3 days a week. He didn't ask permission after the first time. He swept, organized the tools, checked the kiln's heating element. It gave him something to do with his hands that wasn't driving. Margaret appeared in the doorway one Friday 2 weeks, in carrying 2 mugs. She set one on the edge of the work table without comment and took the stool near the shelf. He kept working. She watched. That was how it went for a while, him doing small repairs, her watching from the stool, with her mug, neither of them speaking much. But the silence in the workshop was different from the silence through the partition. It had room in it. Eventually they talked. Not about business, not about schedules. She told him that Michael had wanted to teach, that he'd planned to open a community class in town before everything fell apart. He told her about veterinary school, the night shifts, the smell of antiseptic, the particular feeling of being trusted by something that couldn't ask for help. She listened the way people listen when they're hungry for ordinary conversation. She laughed once, a short, real sound surprised out of her when he described a situation involving a 60-pound bulldog and a very expensive area rug. He hadn't heard that sound come from her before. It changed her face entirely. He drove home that evening thinking that grief, when you pulled back far enough, had a common shape. It didn't care about the size of your house. The knock came on a Saturday morning the first week of December. Ethan opened his front door to find his neighbor, Dorothy Rodriguez, standing on the porch with a letter in her hand. She had lived on Maple Street for 37 years. Her garden in summer was the kind of thing people slowed their cars to look at. She was 71 years old, and she had never once asked him for anything. She held out the letter. He took it. The letter had read, "Whitmore Real Estate Development Group." The language was formal and precise, and said beneath all its careful phrasing that 12 families on Maple Street had 30 days to vacate. The land had been acquired for a commercial development project. Assistance with relocation expenses would be provided upon request. He read it twice. Dorothy was still standing on his porch. "The whole street," he said. "Every house." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. He thought about her garden. He thought about the 40-year-old rose bush at the corner of her fence that she had named because she had lived alone long enough that it made sense to name things. He thought about the 11 other families on this street who had no idea that the woman paying his salary had already decided what to do with the ground beneath their feet. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. The following Monday, he waited until they were in the workshop. He had learned without planning. To that, the workshop was where Margaret was most herself, the walls of formal distance that she maintained, everywhere else thinned inside that room. He set the letter on the work table between them. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up. "You knew," he said. Not a question. "It's a development project. The acquisition was finalized months ago." 12 families, Margaret. It was the first time he had used her name without the title. She registered it, a small tightening around the eyes, but didn't correct him. "The market in that corridor," she began. "Dorothy Rodriguez has lived in that house since 1987. His voice was level, but the effort cost him something. "Her husband is buried in Greenfield Cemetery, the same cemetery you visit every Wednesday." Something crossed her face and was gone. "The project was approved. The contracts are signed." "Then unsign them." "That's not how. You own 40% of the commercial property in this town." The words came out harder than he intended. "Don't tell me there's no room to move." Her jaw set. Michael knew, didn't he? He hadn't planned to say it. The thought had arrived, and he'd spoken it before he could decide not to. He knew about the street, about what you were doing with the land. That was the fight. That was what he couldn't. The bowl, Michael's bowl, the blue one from the center of the work table, was in her hands before he saw her reach for it. It hit the stone floor and broke into 6 pieces. The sound was sharp and final and filled the room completely. Margaret stood with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the fragments. She was breathing hard. He watched the exact moment when the anger left her face and something worse moved in behind it, the particular grief of someone who has just destroyed the last remaining version of something. He picked up his toolbox. He set his key on the shelf above the pegboard, and he walked out. The weeks that followed were the quietest of a quiet year. Ethan took work at a garage on the south end of town, a friend of a former colleague who needed someone reliable and didn't ask too many questions about what he'd been doing before. He wore coveralls and came home with his hands black to the knuckle with engine grease, and the smell of petroleum settled into everything he owned. It was honest work. It paid less than 1/3 of what he'd been making. He didn't go back to Alderman Road. Grace noticed the change not in the way children announce things, but in the way they absorb them. She started drawing again, which should have been a relief except that her drawings had changed. Kites and bare trees, houses with dark windows, a garden where all the flowers were bent sideways, as if something heavy had blown through. He put them on the refrigerator without comment. He didn't know what else to do. Dorothy Rodriguez moved out on a Thursday in mid-December. Her daughter drove up from New Haven with a cargo van, and they spent the morning carrying boxes through the frost. Ethan helped them load the furniture. Dorothy didn't cry. She thanked him 3 times for things he hadn't done, which was worse. The rosebush stayed. By Christmas, demolition equipment had appeared at the far end of Maple Street. The sound of it started before dawn, low, grinding, rhythmic, and reached through the walls of his rental in the early morning like a second alarm clock that couldn't be shut off. On Alderman Road, Margaret Whitmore sealed herself back in. Gerald mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually a version of it reached Ethan in the way information travels through small towns, secondhand, imprecise, but not wrong. She wasn't eating on schedule. She had stopped responding to non-essential correspondence. She stood outside the workshop door for long stretches without going in, as if the room on the other side of it had become a thing she needed to approach slowly, the way you approach an animal that's been hurt. The pottery fragments had been swept into a dustpan and collected in a cloth bag, which Gerald had placed on a shelf. He didn't know what else to do with them either. Ethan heard this and put it in the same place he'd put everything else about Margaret Whitmore, a place in his chest that was neither forgiveness nor its opposite. A place that didn't have a name yet. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in January. He was in the kitchen reheating soup from the day before when his cell phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He answered anyway. 3 years of near-miss emergencies had cured him of letting calls go. A nurse from Harrington General's emergency department explained that his daughter had been brought in by a neighbor following a bicycle accident on Elm. Grace had been trying to ride to her friend's house. The road had been icy in a patch she hadn't seen. The fall had been bad. The fracture was complex, both bones of the forearm displaced. Surgery. $8,000 minimum before insurance calculations that would take weeks to process. He drove to the hospital in 12 minutes and walked into the waiting room with engine grease still on his hands from the afternoon shift because he hadn't thought to stop. He sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent light and looked at the number the billing administrator had written on a form and felt for the first time in a long time that he had reached the absolute bottom of the depth he'd been slowly descending toward. He had $1,700 in his checking account. His daughter was in surgery. And outside, the January dark pressed against the waiting room windows, as if it too had been waiting for the right moment to close in. She was already there when he looked up. Margaret Whitmore stood at the entrance to the surgical waiting room in a dark wool coat, her silver hair pulled back, holding nothing. No folder, no assistant, no intercom between them, just her standing under the fluorescent light, like someone who had made a decision and driven through it before she could change her mind. Ethan didn't stand. He looked at her from the plastic chair and said nothing. She crossed the room and sat down 2 seats away, not beside him, not across from him. Close enough to speak, far enough to leave him room. Gerald called the hospital for an update, she said. They listed no emergency contact. She stopped, rearranged what she was going to say. I wanted to know she was all right. She's in surgery. I know. Margaret set her hands in her lap. I've already spoken to billing, the surgery, the anesthesiologist, the follow-up orthopedic care it's handled. I've also arranged for Dr. Raymond Holt to consult on the repair. He's the best hand and wrist surgeon in Connecticut. He's on his way from Hartford. Ethan looked at the form in his hands, the billing form, with the number that had stopped his breathing 20 minutes ago. He set it on the seat beside him. You can't buy your way through everything, he said. I know that. Her voice didn't waver. I'm not trying to. He looked at the wall. Then why are you here, Margaret? The name came out the same way it had in the workshop, unguarded, stripped of the title. She accepted it the same way she had then. Because I owe you more than I can pay, she said. And I have been trying badly in the wrong order to find a way to begin. She told him in the hospital cafeteria 2 hours later, while Grace was still in surgery and the overhead lights hummed their flat, indifferent note above them. She told him about Road 11, 3 years before the town council had proposed a streetlight installation along a 2-mile stretch of the route, a dark corridor with a documented accident history, 6 incidents in 5 years. The project needed approval from the planning committee. 2 major property holders along the route had raised concerns about light pollution affecting the visual character of the area, which was a polite way of saying they were concerned about property values in a corridor they intended to develop. Margaret had been one of them. She had sent a letter. She had made 2 phone calls, the kind of calls that don't need to be loud to be heard. The project was tabled. 4 months later, on a wet October night, Sarah Reed drove that stretch of Route 11. Margaret had learned whose wife it was 6 weeks after the accident. She didn't say how just that she had, and that the information had arrived at the same time Michael had found out, by some separate path, what she had done. The argument that followed was the last real conversation they had. Michael went back to the city. He relapsed within the month. He was found in the East Wing 3 weeks later. She had been living inside that sequence of events ever since. "I hired you," she said, "because I needed to do something with what I knew. I told myself it was penance. I told myself it was practical. You needed the income, I needed a driver." Both of those things were true. She looked at her coffee, which had gone cold. "But the real reason is that I couldn't keep living behind that gate, knowing what I'd taken from you, and never having to look at you. I tried every morning to simply look at you through that partition. I could not. So I hid behind the intercom instead, and I kept hiding." Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table. He thought about the morning Sarah left for work, the way she had been running late and kissed him quickly already halfway to the door. He had called after her something small, some joke about the coffee she hadn't finished, and she had laughed going down the porch steps. He had heard her laugh from inside the house. He had not let himself think about that morning in a long time, because every time he did, the arithmetic of it broke him open. 5 minutes earlier, a different route, a lit road. A lit road. His hands pressed harder against the table. "You knew," he said. "From the beginning. You knew the whole time." "Yes." The word landed between them and stayed there. He didn't speak for a long time. Margaret didn't fill the silence, which was the one thing she did in that moment, that he might have been unable to forgive her for if she had. He thought about Grace at her desk at 10:30 at night, bent over the paper, the brush in her hand. He thought about the note card, "Your daughter doesn't owe anyone a reason for the silence." He thought about the sound of Margaret laughing in the workshop, surprised by it, the way the whole shape of her face had changed for just that 1 second. He thought about Dorothy Rodriguez standing on his porch with a letter she hadn't deserved. He thought about Michael, 29 years old, carrying something that wasn't his fault and couldn't be undone, and nowhere to put it. "He couldn't forgive you," Ethan said, not as an accusation. "No," her voice was barely there. "He couldn't. And you couldn't forgive yourself." "I still can't." He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way he used to look at the animals that came into the clinic, reading past the surface of things. What he saw was not a villain. What he saw was a person who had made a calculation that seemed reasonable until it became unbearable, and who had been carrying the unbearable part alone in a house behind an iron gate for 3 years. It didn't make it right. Nothing would make it right. But he understood with a clarity that felt cold and clean that he had a choice about what he did with what he understood. Grace's voice, when it came, was small and slightly blurred with anesthesia. She was in the recovery room, her arm bandaged from wrist to elbow, blinking at the ceiling. Ethan was beside her immediately, her good hand in both of his. She looked around the room at the equipment, at the curtains at his face, and then past his shoulder at Margaret, who had followed him to the door and stood just inside it, uncertain. Grace studied her for a moment. "You look like you've been crying," Grace said with the frank observation of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she doesn't notice things. Margaret's expression shifted. Something yielded in it. "A little," Margaret said. Grace looked at her father, then back at the woman in the doorway. Then she lifted her bandaged arm slightly, not to show it off, but in the uncomplicated way of a child who has decided someone nearby is sad and should be brought closer. "You can come in," Grace said. "There's a chair." Later, much later, past midnight when Grace had been moved to a room and had fallen asleep with her arm resting on a pillow, Ethan and Margaret sat in the hospital cafeteria again. The same table, the same bad light. Different people than the ones who had sat here hours before, or at least people who knew different things about themselves. "The development project," Ethan said. "I'll halt it." She said it without drama, as if the decision had already been made, and she was simply reporting it. "The families who remain on Maple Street will receive permanent lease renewals at current rates written into the deed. I'll establish a housing assistance fund, low-interest loans, priority for long-time residents." Dorothy Rodriguez. "She's already at her daughter's." "I know, I'll reach out." She looked at her hands. "I don't expect it to fix anything." "It won't." "I know." He nodded. Outside the cafeteria windows, the January dark had thinned slightly, the particular way night begins to give up the hour before dawn. Not quite light yet, but no longer entirely dark. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive you tonight," he said. "I don't know if that's something I get to decide in one night. I'm not asking you to. But I'm not going to let it be the only thing either." He thought about how to say the rest of it. Sarah wouldn't want that. She was practical. She would have said that keeping the anger means keeping the thing that caused it, and she had no patience for keeping things that didn't serve any purpose. Margaret looked at him. "She sounds like someone I would have wanted to know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she was. She really was. He thought of the bowl. In the weeks that followed, the slow, unglamorous weeks of Grace's recovery of paperwork and lease renewals and phone calls to Dorothy Rodriguez that were difficult in the way necessary. Things often are. He kept returning to the image of it. 6 pieces on a stone floor. Michael's bowl, 3 years of being the only finished thing in a locked room, and then 1 moment of breaking. He did some research, found the technique in a book Grace brought home from the school library, which she had checked out because the cover had a picture of something gold and broken, and she wanted to know what it was called. Kintsugi. Japanese craft, centuries old. The art of repairing broken ceramics with lacquer mixed with gold, silver, or platinum. The philosophy behind it was simple and unreasonable, and exactly right. The breakage is part of the history of the object. You don't disguise it. You illuminate it. He brought the cloth bag with the fragments to the workshop on a Saturday in February. Margaret was there, sitting on her stool, and she went still when she saw what he was carrying. He set the bag on the work table without explaining. She looked at it for a long time. Then she reached in and arranged the 6 pieces on the table, fitting them against each other, the way you fit the pieces of something you know by memory. They worked slowly. Gold, where the cracks had been. Grace sat on a stool in the corner with a sketchbook in her lap, her casted arm resting against her side, watching with the focused attention she gave to things she was studying for later. She drew them 2 adults at a work table, bent over something broken, making it into something else. She didn't know she was drawing a portrait of forgiveness. She was just drawing what she saw. By the following summer, the gates at the end of Alderman Road stood open most days. The workshop ran Tuesday and Thursday afternoons community ceramics, open enrollment $2 per session, or whatever you could manage. The garden on the estate's east side became a shared plot. 12 raised beds, tomatoes, squash, herbs, and 1 stubborn row of sunflowers that Grace had insisted on, and that bloomed in July so large and bright they were visible from the road. Dorothy Rodriguez came back on a Saturday in June, not to move back, her daughter's house had grown on her, but to plant. She brought a cutting from the rose bush. She pressed it into the corner bed herself, talking to it the whole time, in the low, patient way she talked to things she intended to outlive her. Ethan found his way back to the work he'd trained for a small veterinary practice, 2 days a week, out of a building on Birch Street, that he leased at a rate that made him suspicious until he stopped looking into it. He didn't ask Margaret directly. She didn't confirm. Some things he had learned were better received without the full accounting. On the kitchen table at the center of the estate's main dining room, the repaired bowl sat between a pitcher of water and a pile of fruit from the garden. The gold lines caught the afternoon light and held it the way scar tissue holds the memory of the wound while the rest of the skin moves forward. He had said in that cafeteria at 2 in the morning that he didn't know if forgiveness was something you decided in one night. What he learned over the months that followed was that it wasn't a decision at all. It was a practice, something you came back to, the way Grace came back to the blank page, the way Margaret came back to the garden, the way the town of Mystic came back to itself, slowly, one open gate at a time. The best days were not the days without grief. They were the days grief had been given somewhere to go.